Welcome to the But She's Your Mother podcast, where we talk about all things related to being raised by narcissistic parents. Our guests are adult survivors of child abuse. Please note that this podcast is intended for mature audiences and may feature topics such as emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, murder, and eating disorders. Opinions expressed by guests and survivors are their own. Some names may be changed or blocked out to protect minors, victims, and survivors. Thank you for listening to But She's Your Mother, the podcast. Today's guest is J.D. McCabe. JD is a domestic violence survivor and the author of The Third Gift, My Dance with the Devil and Her Mother.
So she was seeing a therapist. She would come home and she would say to me, my therapist says I have the right to see your emails and your phone and all that because, she thinks you're cheating on me. And I'm like, what? Initially I would laugh it off, but when these would continue every 3 or 4 months, I'd become quite defensive going, what are you talking about? I said, first of all, I have no passcode on my phone. You know my username and password from my personal email. Go through it. And, I ignored my intuition because I probably should have said, let me see your phone and let me see your email. I would later discover down the road when we got to the alimony trial, she had 17 different email accounts.
Oh, wow.
So yes, her gaslighting projection began probably 3.5 to 4 years before the tornado really came. And the tornado came in the form of not only her, but her mother as well.
You mentioned, I don't want to forget to ask you this, and I do want to get back into this part of the story, but you mentioned that when I guess you walked into the house and with her mother and her mother threatened your life. And it sounds like you were dumbstruck because you didn't know what was going on. What do you think, or what do you now know was the basis for her mother saying, I'm going to kill you, or if you hurt her, or what happened there? Because you mentioned that in the beginning, and I think somebody's going to have a question about that.
I was on our illustrious beach trip, but as I came up from the beach, I don't know where they went, but they were two standing on the edge of the other side of the granite countertop, and she had death in her eyes. And that once I got over the initial shock of it, I said, what would make you think that I would put my hands on your daughter? She said, she had to pause for a minute or two. She said, she told me you shook the dishwasher rack and broke it. I said, I shook the dishwasher rack, but I didn't break it. But as you know, for the last 6 months, this is me communicating to her, things have been not going so well in our marriage. There's been an awful lot of tension and an awful lot of arguments, but I never broke the dishwasher rack. And we kind of left it at that. And then the one thing that's weird, Marnie, is, as I said, her only brother was on the trip. He wasn't involved in this conversation. He never came up to me on this beach trip and said, hey, we need to chat. I'm hearing that my sister's afraid of you and da-da-da-da-da. The exact opposite happened. I was cooking out one night. We were cooking out together. It was just him and I wanted to be real clear with him. And I wanted to be real clear that I'm not cheating on your sister. I said, hey, I want to talk about it. And he just looked at me and said, you sure? I said, yeah, I am absolutely sure. I've never been inappropriate at all with another woman. But he never said anything to me about her alleged fear. But whatever she was telling her mother, whatever story she was beginning to build, was what caused her mother to say that. But at the same time, looking back now, I'm not so sure the acorn didn't fall too far from the tree. You know what I mean? I'm not so sure her mother didn't have some issues as well.
Sounds like they had a dynamic going, right? And I think that it also sounds to me, based on the book, that there was a payoff for your ex-wife to be the victim, and she got her mother's love and affection and attention through that. So there was something that she was getting there by being your victim, right? And I think that had a lot to do with her elevating it, because otherwise Why bother roping her mother in? Why not just go after you on her own? She didn't really need her mother, but she wanted her mother, kind of thing, right? The I guess it was 2014 is when she was actually, unbeknownst to you, diagnosed with herpes. Was this what made you realize that she had been cheating on you since 2014, or did that make you realize it was even earlier than that?
No, that revelation occurred in July of 2015. My STD expert would say she contracted it in April, March, April. The importance of that and why we got an STD expert involved, because in North Carolina, if there's proof of infidelity within the terms of a marriage, that guilty party should be, by law, barred from alimony. And because we had been married 23 years, it would be, and she was a stay-at-home mom, it would be probably a pretty significant, hit for me. But anyhow, that revelation, I didn't know that she had this long history of infidelity until I started looking at her medical claims and her pharmacy claims, and started looking at seeing all sorts of antibiotics, all sorts of medications for, burning and itching and things in the female region. And I know some of that can happen naturally, but she had 23 antibiotic prescriptions in 45 months. And she had been tested, more than likely diagnosed with chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, you name it. A lot of the symptoms that I started to see that I linked to her autoimmune disease are more than likely due to secondary stages of syphilis. I spent hours getting educated on the STDs and CDC treatment guidelines. And so she would have patchy hair loss, mouth sores, inflamed lymph nodes. And I'm thinking, oh man, you poor thing. This is all, and it could be from an autoimmune disease, but it's like you don't even have one. So as I dug into it, the main treatment for syphilis, the recommended treatment is penicillin. Guess what? She's allergic to penicillin. So the next best thing that could be prescribed is another antibiotic called doxycycline, which I found a slew of prescriptions for doxycycline in her pharmacy claims.
So essentially, all this time that she was accusing you of cheating and this horrific behavior, it was her who was cheating, engaging in obviously very high risk sex practices and contracting multiple STDs, and also endangering you.
Yeah. And they say that you would know better, right? But they say that is a characteristic of somebody with borderline personality disorder, correct?
Well, it can be borderline, it can be NPD, it could be any of those, anywhere in the cluster beyond that spectrum, sociopath, because what they're doing is they're projecting their own bad behavior onto you. They're really telling on themselves, but they do it in such a way where you're so emotionally hooked in, and it happened to you, right? You go on the defensive because you love this person and you're trying to fix it. And on top of that, she's really, really ill, which is playing on your love and your sympathies also as a man to his wife. Men like to fix things, right? So there's
Yep.
other layers to this that she really leveraged and capitalized on pretty easily, because she's the mother of your children, and you had this earlier memory of this good person that you thought lived inside there. And I bet you when you look back now, you're not seeing that so much. You're going, yeah, now that I look back at it. But when you're really enamored with somebody and they draw you in, and they're all those things that you've ever hoped for, because this is what happens with somebody who is toxic or with a personality disorder. They identify everything you need and they become what you want. They're a chameleon. And then slowly, or sometimes quickly, the mask falls and they stop that chameleon behavior and they start being who they really are. And then, of course, things fall apart. And by that time,
Correct.
you're so deeply in it, and you're just trying to save the marriage with the woman that you fell in love with that never existed in the first place. With your daughter, because she did really drive a huge wedge between the two of you, to the point that your daughter, it sounds like, was afraid of you, didn't want to be around you, was very protective of her mom and all of that. Talk to me about when that started, how long it went on, and what repaired it.
It started, I would say late, again, the infamous spring of 2014 when things really started to happen. I think that's when I started to notice my daughter pulling away from me a little bit. And of course, she was 15, so she's not going to come to me, where she didn't come to me and say, "Hey, Dad, this is what I'm hearing from Mom. Is any of this true?" She didn't. It's probably in 2015, but 2014, 2015. So even when I was still in the home, and I think my time in the psych facility further confirm again, her plan was coming together so beautifully, only further confirmed for my daughter, your father, has got some issues. So once we'd reconcile, and I can talk about that, but once we reconciled, she came back into my life and made the decision to move in with me. She opened up a little bit and said, "Yeah, Mom said that when you were in there for a drug addiction and depression. Even though you deny using drugs, you had a positive test," which I never had, of course. But it started in 2014, 2015. She came back into my life in March of 2016. I was on a business trip. We had started to communicate a little bit, and she texted me, and I had to get up out of the conference and leave because I started silently crying out loud, if that makes any sense. But she said she wanted to see me. And so once I got to see her, it was about a week later that she said, "Dad, I want to come live with you." And I'm like, wow, wow, this is a day that I had hoped and prayed for. What turned the tables for her was she witnessed, and I know it because I had access to Mom's medical claims and pharmacy claims, and I watched them like a hawk. She witnessed Mom in a drug withdrawal as she came home from high school one day. They were renting a home, and her mother couldn't walk, she couldn't talk. There was dog food all over the floor. She ended up having to take her mother to the ER to be evaluated yet again, for another alleged stroke issue. But she never was ever diagnosed. And she had two of these stroke-like events during our marriage when we were still happy, and I use happy in quotations, that I was there for, that I witnessed. And I would later learn that it's truly a side effect of the amphetamines, especially when you're taking three of them, three different formulations. So she witnessed that, and she was strongly encouraged by one of her best friends at the time. She's like, "You need to reach out to your dad, and you need to go live with your dad." People started seeing her delusions, her paranoia. Just it was off the charts. So I thank God every day that my kids, and again, listening to your podcast and hearing about the young kids and all that, thank God every day that my kids were old enough to see the truth for themselves. So she was 17 when she moved in with me, and she's never looked back.
What's really interesting to me is that at 13 is when she was getting really involved in her activities like cheerleading and all that. In spite of being so sick, she was able to do that and take those trips and have those one-on-one times. And what that tells me is likely she was grooming her all throughout that time. And the time that you were put into the psych ward was the icing on the cake, but the groundwork had been going on for a very, very long time prior to that. That's evident to me anyway. I don't 100% know that, but if I was a guessing girl, based on what I see, I would say that that's what was happening. The division was occurring during that time, especially when you tell me that when you went to pick them up from the airport, she wouldn't let go of her hand. That tells a story right there. And those are those really not so little things that we question and we file away, that I hope listeners out there who are experiencing those little not so subtle things take notice of them. That's part of the reason we do this show, so that you can start to build a picture of accuracy to be able to protect yourself and your children. That's the point in my mind of sharing these bits and pieces, because you never know what's going to click with somebody.
And I really love what you're doing, and the platform you're creating for folks to share these stories and build a sense of community and begin to raise the awareness of all this. Because I had no idea about any of this stuff prior to going through this journey. I knew what a narcissist was, or what I thought it was, but no clue what projection was or gaslighting was. I didn't hear the term gaslighting until my domestic violence trial, when my attorney covered the mic on the table and said, she's willing to say anything about you. She's gaslighting you. I'm like, what does that mean? He said, look it
Oh,
up.
that's right. She tried to get a restraining order against you. Share with the audience what that looked like.
So I hadn't seen her in like 4 months. When I was up in Pennsylvania, my parents were alive at the time, and I was up in Pennsylvania for a family event. And I got a phone message from, the New Hanover County Sheriff. I thought, ooh, in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm waiting for that phone call that says, yeah, we found your ex-wife dead from an overdose or whatever. But that wasn't the case. But they said, yeah, we got some papers to serve on you. I said, for what? He said, oh, we don't read them. We just serve them. But your soon to be ex-wife has filed a restraining order against you. I'm like, I haven't seen her in 4 months. And so when I got back, a few days later, when I got back and I was served and I read through the papers again, the system is so broken, Marnie, that, you can file whatever you want, and say whatever you want, and get your day in court. And she, alleged in there that I'm abusing prescription. I'm abusing prescription drugs. I'm an alcoholic. My daughter fears for me. My daughter doesn't want to be around me. She asking for not only a restraining order, but temporary, she wanted full-time custody of my daughter and so forth, so on, that I need to turn in my firearms and my ammunition. Well, I never owned a gun. I've never owned a gun in my life. And she just filled this out. And of course, and rightfully so, 5 days later, I'm in court for a hearing. And there was a blessing to that, because I had to quickly educate my new attorney that handled the domestic violence case, because my other attorney didn't handle those. I had to educate him on the madness that was going on and what I discovered. And essentially, the judge denied the restraining order, but she did admonish me and say there's been some communications in spite of a mediated agreement that you would not communicate with her. Well, I sent her a couple of texts and I made a phone call on the evening of what would have been our 22nd anniversary, I believe. I'll admit I was a little bit in the juice, still heartbroken and devastated, and just by everything that was going on. And I made a mistake texting her a couple of times and calling her. But the voicemail message that I left, that I didn't recall leaving her, all it simply said was, Aaron, stop the charade. I didn't threaten her. Thank God for that, in which I never did. But yeah, so that got denied. And interestingly enough, she dragged my daughter into court to potentially testify against me. And I remember my attorney looking at me saying, how dare she? How dare she drag that child into this courtroom? I said, that pisses me off. And I'm like, yeah, rightfully so. But fortunately, my daughter didn't stay in the courtroom because she was a minor at the time. And she never testified against me. But it was when I got the subpoena, when I got a list of who all they subpoenaed, I literally began to tremor when I saw that my own daughter was going to testify, because I'm like, what is she going to say? I've never put a hand on my daughter. I've never done anything to abuse my daughter. But it's like, what has her head been filled with that my daughter's going to have to testify to?
It shows also the lengths of which they'll go to weaponize their own children, and they have no conscience about it, no care, as long as they're getting their needs met. Where
Yeah.
does the relationship today stand between both of your children and their mother?
They don't have a relationship with her. They haven't seen her in 4 years. I went no contact 6 years ago with her, and I'm maintained that no contact. My son's probably been no contact for 2.5 to 3 years, and my daughter just went no contact. She goes off and on a little bit, but she really hasn't had any contact, to my knowledge, in probably a year and a half.
Yeah.
And the straw that broke that back was when mom kept trying to send them stuff either in the mail or over text, bogus medical tests and things that she's having to prove that she doesn't have herpes. She's still alleging that she doesn't have a sexually transmitted disease, and she didn't cheat on dad. She doesn't have a drug addiction. He spent all this money to get his experts to say what he wanted to say, and they got tired of it. They're, again, young adults, wise adults, that they're like, I'm going to remove the toxicity from my lives. And my daughter said something to me just last night, interestingly, because she's soon to get married in May. Her mother and her grandmother missed her high school graduation. Her grandmother has since passed, but her mother wasn't at her college graduation. Their mother has not really been in their lives for about 8 years now. And it's a blessing that they're able to breathe easy and focus on themselves. But last night was my daughter's text exchange about some things with the wedding. And she said to me, which hit me, she said, Dad, family are those that you have a relationship with. Family has nothing to do with blood. Yeah. She said, if it had to do with blood, I would have invited my mom to this wedding. And I'm like, wow, when did you become so wise?
Unfortunately, children in these situations become wise very quickly and have to grow up too quickly as well, right? And your daughter really nailed it. I always say when I'm referring to the people that I have relationships with that I love, that they are my family, and the people I don't are just my relatives. And yeah. It's a bittersweet time, even though your daughter is saying that, I'm sure, because every person who grows up and gets married, we want our parents there. We want them celebrating it. I hope that your daughter realizes that if her mother was to be there, it would be about her mother, and it would actually be a likely catastrophe based on her, previous behavior. Historically, we know that she's just not a stable, kind, loving human being with the capacity to see anybody else or meet anybody else's needs other than her own.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, unfortunately, there's been several wonderful people, women, that have stepped up, aunts, uncles, and some of girlfriends' parents and stuff, that over these last 7, 8 tumultuous years have stepped up to fill that role.
We find a chosen family. We build family.
You know better than anybody, right? Yep, your own personal journey for sure.
Looking backwards, with everything that you know now, going back to the beginning of all of this, of even when you married your ex-wife, what, if anything, would you do differently?
I love this question, and I've had a lot from others as well. But what would I do differently? I would, and it has nothing to do with her. But to the young listeners out there, whether it's male, female, whatever, don't put constraints on yourself from an age perspective. Don't look at go, I'm 26, I'm 27. I don't think kids do it these days, but at the time at 26, I'm like, a lot of my friends are married. We met, I like her, we like hanging out. What would I do differently? I shouldn't have married her. And I remember driving to the chapel, and my brother was my best man. It was a very small wedding. We had 85 people there, which is most of my immediate family. And in my gut, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this. And obviously I grew to love her, or who I thought she was, grew to love her. But looking back on, I would say to the young folks, make a list. And I've done this since I've been back in a relationship now, a wonderful relationship, my first relationship since a divorce with a fantastic woman. Make a list of must-haves and deal breakers. And I had 26 at the time, 28 when I got married or whatever it was. I didn't sit down and think about what I wanted in somebody as a lifetime partner. I didn't have a list of must-haves. I didn't have a list of deal breakers. I put an age on it and thought, 26, probably a good time to get married.
The other thing I would say to that I see happens a lot is, we had that feeling. You had that feeling in your gut. Your body never lies to you. I tell this to people all the time. If you have a feeling, it's because your body is remembering or identifying something that you consciously are not aware of. It never, ever lies to you. And we've been somewhat trained because of expectations, because of an age, because of these different, social pressures, whatever, to push that stuff down because we want to fit in, or we want to please people, or, be on par with our friends and things like that. If you just take a moment, I love the list. Absolutely, 100,000%. You should be doing that with every relationship that you have that has significance. What is the value add? What is the value takeaway? Listen to your body. That being said, when you look back, kind of related, unrelated, when you look back at how she was parenting your children, like when she was beginning to create division between you and your daughter, when she was sabotaging your son's, little puppy love relationship. I don't want to diminish it, but you know what I'm
Yep.
saying, right? He was 16. When she was doing that, particularly with what she was doing with your daughter because of the division, and this is a big deal in the world today, where we see this is what parental alienation actually looks like, by the way. And I don't like to use those words because so many toxic parents reverse it and capitalize on it. So I'm really careful about how I talk about that. What would you do? What would you tell somebody who's in that circumstance and starts to see those subtle things of, for example, keeping your daughter's hand or spending more controlled time with that child, those little red flags that were popping up? Is there something that you would do differently?
If I had not been locked up in a psychiatric facility, let me clarify what I mean by that, because once I got out of there and I could feel her fear and trepidation, she gave me a nice little side hug when I got home. Like, welcome home, Dad. I don't know why you were there, and this only heightens my fear of you. But had that not occurred, and I had not allowed that to occur, I had not become isolated and had my identity stolen from me. If depending on the age, of course, it's age appropriate, but at her age, I would have had a conversation with her individually to understand where some of the disrespect is coming from, what some of her sentiments are, give me specific examples of perhaps some things that I've done that cause you apprehension or fear or whatever. I would have had an open and honest conversation with her. I certainly did when she moved in with me at 17 and started asking a few questions. We didn't focus a whole lot on what was going on with her and her mother, because I wanted to rebuild the relationship. So we didn't get into it only when she wanted to get into it. But when she started asking for proof of mom's drug addiction and all that, I laid out what I had discovered. So depending on the age, I would say have an open and transparent conversation with your kid or kids to understand specific examples of what's causing their change of heart, their disrespect, their apprehension, their fear, whatever the case may be. Because there was nothing in my past relationship with her that would lead her to believe that.
That is absolutely a great suggestion, and that is the way to go. You said something really good in there that you would really focus, and you did after the fact, on how your daughter was feeling and where those feelings were coming from and removing her mother from it. That's a really important technique to use because otherwise the child is going to feel that sense of disloyalty, right? And that fear, and that's already being played on over there. So when we on the other side say, how are you feeling? Is there a specific reason why you feel fearful of me? Are you worried about something? And really focusing on the child's well-being and emotions, that's the thing I can guarantee you that the other parent isn't doing. Because what the other parent is doing is focusing on their own emotions and their own needs and trashing the other parent. And that child is a weapon who is also invisible in that dynamic. The other thing I want to say is you used the word that you allowed that to happen to you when you ended up in the psych ward. You did not allow that to happen to you. You were victimized by somebody who was absolutely preying on your love, your care, and your vulnerabilities, and doing so very methodically behind the scenes. And there is no way you could have known that that's what was occurring. So you didn't allow that. You
I,
were
appre-
victimized.
I appreciate that. The only clarity I would provide to that, to reinforce what we talked about earlier, is had I confided in somebody, I may have been able to avoid that. I may have had some objectivity pumped into my head that I was lacking. So yeah, but you're right. You're right. But that's where when I use the term allowed, that's where I go, is like, why didn't you talk to your brother? Why didn't you open up to somebody about what was going on?
It's complex, right? We carry a
Yeah.
lot of feelings around it. Plus, if we think we're the reason that all of this is happening, it's hard to approach someone and take that risk that they're not going to go, well, what did you do? And a lot of people do that. So it's a real fear. And that's when their reaction has to matter less than you trying to get the perspective that you need. So if you tell somebody who does react that way to you, tell somebody else and tell somebody else until you find your, I like to call it spirit animal, but support person.
Yep. I love the phrase spirit animal. And I
Yeah.
also I love, again, really applaud your platform, but I've never thought about that phone call when I was in a psych facility that she was trying to inflame me, maybe to keep me
Oh
there,
yeah.
just poking me. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
It's very
Total setup. Yeah.
brilliant, brilliant insight. Brilliant insight. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you like to leave all of our listeners and viewers for YouTube? What message would you like to leave to them?
My message, which I've tried to tell people consistently, the message is there is purpose to pain. Adversity is, this ain't heaven. Okay. So we're all going to experience pain at various levels. Pain is pain. Adversity is adversity. Embrace it. See it as an opportunity for growth and just recognize you'll get through it. You'll make it to the other side. And there is a song, well, I'm a little bit hurt, but a lot more free. Max McNown, and the lyric that struck me, Marnie, in there was, am I crazy to be grateful for all the pain? And I would say, no, I'm not crazy. I am grateful for all the pain. I'm grateful for the emotional freedom. I'm grateful to have a second shot at life and to be out of a marriage and a relationship that was a lie and was extremely abusive. And thus the title of the book. I mean, the third gift couldn't be more appropriate because all of this baggage came and all of these Russian dolls were open because of that one little accusation that I gave her herpes.
Thank you so much for being on, But She's Your Mother, the podcast. I appreciate you being here, JD.
I've absolutely enjoyed it. And I thank you very much. And I wish you continued success with all your journeys and all you're trying to do.